Hi, this week I'm trying to tackle the questions from this week's assignment. So the question number one is about are you more comfortable preaching the gospel from the Old Testament or the New Testament? And if one is preferred, why um, from the other? So to be honest, I was not comfortable preaching the gospel from the Old Testament. But this week's readings and the lectures gives many ways to preach the gospel from the Old Testament and also the New Testament. I'm thankful for that. I would like to try preaching the gospel from the Old Testament. Even though I prefer preaching the gospel from the New Testament, my reasoning is simple because the New Testament provides a very direct connection to the story of Jesus and the embedded good news there. And also, along with the theological implications and advantages um, of becoming a child of God, mentioned mainly in Paul's writings, um, New Testament seems to provide a very direct approach to the gospel. And that would be my thinking why New Testament is better to bring the gospel. But this week's readings is very interesting, and I would love to try preaching the gospel from the Old Testament. Second question is reflect on all the preaching of the gospel you've heard or sat under. Has it been a balanced diet of both the old and new? Um, if and if it is restricted, then is one book or genre of the New Testament is mentioned more than the other. Most of the gospel preaching I've heard is from the New Testament. Um, it was mainly based on the theological insights of Paul's writing, like predestination and aspects like that. I have also heard the gospel based on the Old Testament passages, like, for example, Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, Micah 5:3, or Isaiah 9, verse 6, and those kind of passages. But otherwise, the majority of the preaching I've heard from the OT were geared mainly towards increasing virtues like our faith, um, or portraying our God as an awesome and powerful God, so that our trust in the Lord and the power of God and His sovereignty is increasing. Sometimes even without mentioning Jesus. I've heard these kind of sermons based on the Old Testament. So looking back, it may not have been a balanced diet of the gospel presented from the Old Testament and New Testament. I'm talking about my own experience. But it was great to hear Pastor Chris mention about, especially how to preach the gospel from the book of Revelation. That I found it very interesting because, as he mentioned, the Lord is depicted as the victorious King and Messiah who would reign because of his salvific work on the cross and the victory of the death, devil, and all principalities and powers. And as he mentioned, um, I am a kind of used to the eschatological teaching or insights from the book of Revelation. And his lecture was a great encouragement to try to preach the gospel from the book of Revelation. Third question is, should all evangelistic preaching be balanced, equally drawing from both the Old and the New Testament, as well as from all the books of each of these testaments? I think yes. I think all evangelistic preaching should equally draw from the Old Testament and the New Testament. I think the listeners should be given a chance to hear the gospel from all the books of the Bible, because we have the whole covenant. In his book, for example, author Julian Kim, in his book Preaching the Whole Counsel of God, he notes that every Old Testament and New Testament passage must be seen in the light of the redemptive context and not just the historical. And he continues to say that the narrow history and the experience of Israel and the ultimate redemptive story of God in the gospel of Christ must be considered while reading, interpreting, and preaching from any passages of the Old Testament. And I found it very interesting and encouraging. Daniel Weaver, in his article, also puts forward a concept called preaching as covenant renewal for preaching the gospel from the Old Testament. According to him, the covenantal preaching seeks to honor the authorial intent and the ethical demand of the text while engaging a new community whose foundational narrative is found in the blood and resurrection of Christ. So he is not downplaying the ethical aspects, but he's connecting it and linking it with the gospel. And I found it really interesting and good. Pastor Chris also gives various ways to preach the gospel from the Old Testament, like the promise fulfillment, typology, analogy, bigger themes or longitudinal themes, or contrast, among some to explore, to connect with the gospel of Jesus Christ. He also advises regarding the danger of falling into moral and legal teaching from the Old Testament as well as the New Testament passages without tying the preaching with the gospel. Fourth question is, in your experience and in your opinion, what are the biggest challenges of preaching the gospel from the Old Testament? I think the biggest challenge is the effort needed to draw the indirect links of the Old Testament passages. That, of course, is the part of the overarching redemptive history. But the difficulty of learning that and understanding that and tying with the gospel story of Jesus seems to be the biggest challenge. There seems to be also a fear that the Old Testament may not clearly bring the gospel to the hearers as the New Testament would do. However, I think this week's lectures and the readings are very encouraging to preach the gospel from the Old Testament. The last question is, in your experience and your opinion, what are the biggest challenges of preaching the gospel from the New Testament? I think preaching the gospel from the New Testament is relatively easy when compared to the Old Testament. There seems to be a danger of falling into teaching just mere morality or character formation without giving emphasis or primacy to the gospel story. And Pastor Chris points out that very clearly, that this could even be the teachings of Jesus, his mercy, his character, like his mercy, his compassion towards people, or even the great characters of the New Testament, like the disciples, the way they lived a very sacrificial life. Those kind of aspects can become important, and the gospel story may become less important in the light of it. So that could be a danger, but we need to remember that the gospel story is the main theme that enables us to live a godly living. And that is my thoughts here. And thank you for listening. Blessings.